Hello everybody, and welcome to Soundwave Mania 2 Grand Finals Full Showcase. It's been quite a while since we looked over these pools, which I do apologize for. I have been a bit busy with some other tournaments, but now we can actually get into this final pool that I'm sure many people are waiting to see. But starting us off with our first prize pick, it is going to be the edit of Tekken on 1.05. I think some people might be familiar with this pick. Like I said, this is going to be your speed pick. It is going to be a little bit of a more unconventional speed pick, with a lot of jumps and a lot of just tricky patterning in general being in this speed pick overall. I mean, you start off very simple with the slight jump shoot and shoots, but you slowly get into this next part, which is going to be probably the easiest out of all the speed sections. You do see these mini jacks in here, like right here, and these like transitions that go right to left, left to right. It makes for a little bit of a difficult speed pick in general, like just this part alone, especially just because you do have to do a lot of transitioning between left to right and right to left. But once that part does finish, you do get a little bit of a kind of mini break. It's more of just these vocal jumps with these jumps and hands being on the lighter side of the snappings, I believe at 1/5, so it's definitely a lot slower compared to the strings, but it can still be a little bit tricky if you aren't watching. And onto this next section, which is going to be a repeat of the first section. So you're going to see a lot of these movements, but they're going to be a little bit I believe it happens a little bit more compared to this first section. And of course you do have these mini jacks, you have these trills just all around. And as well as this section being a little bit extended compared to the beginning, because once you do finish that speed section, you do get these 1/6, 1/5 streams. A little bit slower compared to the main streams, which are on 1/8. So I believe around 354 BPM. Which might sound a little bit slow, especially for grand finals, but this pick gets fairly dense, especially as we do get into this ending section, this final stream section. You're going to see the density ramp up a little bit, you're going to see those jumps become a little bit more prevalent, and you're also going to see a lot more mini jacks, fluctuating between these jumps and these mini jacks every 1-1, which is just going to make this a lot more trickier. Not to mention that you already have some of these mini jacks within the streams already, so this just adds another layer of difficulty, especially as we see these jumps, which makes it a lot more denser, a lot more tight, and it does require a lot of finger control. It is a speed pick after all, and especially with this ending where things start to get a lot more cluttered, and you start to see some 3-node speed sections, especially like right here. But once you do manage to survive all that, you do get into this ending where you just have to not let go of these elements. I mean, there's not really much to say. But that does conclude our first rice pick, our speed. And we can move on to our jump stream hand stream pick, our shorter one. And it is going to be 9999 on 1.1. Maybe not as familiar to some people. This is a reuse from Philippine Nationals. Instead of 1.50 mil, it is going to be a 1.1, so you do get a little bit of leniency on a pick like this one. But that does also mean that this pick is just slightly longer, not by too much. And it is going to be, like I said, the denser jump stream pick, and also a shorter one. Despite this one being the shorter one, it's still pretty stamina intensive. I mean, it's grand finals, of course you expect these picks to be very stamina intensive, but I think traditionally these shorter jump shoot picks, they tend not to be as stamina intensive and maybe not as continuous as something like this one. The main difficulty really just comes from all these tricky transitions between these trills and all these other trills that surround as well as just anchors that it creates. And then moving on to this second section, things get a little bit more lenient, but they're gonna slowly ramp up just a little bit more. I mean, you see these trills really start to begin, and especially with these hands starting to be introduced again, that transition as well is just gonna be really tricky to stay consistent on, and especially just because there's a lot of kind of wrist rotation in a pick like this one, just because it is very left to right and right to left. And especially these inner column trills are gonna be really hard if you aren't like comfortable with this speed. It's just a lot of this really fast burst of these like denser patterns, and that's what really makes this very tricky. and as well as just the density on top of that. There's just so much to do on a pick like this one. It's not very simple like you might expect with regular jump shoot pincher picks. I mean, of course it's dense, but like even dense picks can still be very simple. But you have like these anchors, you have these trills, whether it be the one-handed trills or just two-handed trills, both just being equally as hard. I mean, of course these one-handed ones still be a little bit harder, but they aren't as long as the two-handed ones. And then getting into this ending core jack here, if you're able to survive all these dense jump shoot patterns, then this ending should be fairly fine. But that does conclude race 2. A pretty dense pick, and a very fast one at that, 266. But with that, move on to race 3, which is going to be Moon Earth on 1.4 times. Another pick that might be maybe known, but I think this one's probably going to be one of the lesser known picks, especially coming from Shoegazer as well. I think most people are very familiar with a lot of other Shoegazer picks, such as maybe Strange Program, Black Chocolates. This one is, I would say, very akin to another Shoegazer pick if you do know Blue Army. But this one I would say is a lot more trickier and it is a lot more continuous. This beginning section especially, it just puts you right into this really tricky section with a lot of anchors and a lot of right and left-handed trills. I mean, once you get into one of these sections, it's continuous right-handed trills, and then it, of course, mirrors to go into the left hand, but still, I mean, that makes trying to mirror this a lot more harder, especially if you're trying to make it a little bit easier on one hand, because it doesn't really favor either hand, it just goes back and forth between each hand, and that adds a lot of difficulty, especially with the density right here, and the anchors that it creates as well. You can really notice these anchors, though, within the middle columns. And I think that's probably another layer of difficulty that most people probably don't even look at. But as we do get into the section where the vocal starts to become a little bit more apparent, we're going to get into a little bit of a break part. So hopefully you are able to kind of maintain this beginning part, because if you aren't, you might just be a little screwed for this next section, which is just so continuous. But there isn't really much here. I mean, it's just these single notes from jacks. The density ramps up just a little bit here, but not too bad. And you might see the BPM and think 266, that's not too bad, that's not too fast. But when you factor in just the slight density this pick has compared to a lot of other Shoegazer picks, it becomes a lot more harder, especially with this section right here. This is where the trills start to become very apparent. And it's so easy to just mess up on them. It's so hard to stay consistent on this. And you might not think this pick is that bad, but try to play this for basically 4 minutes straight. That's the main difficulty. And as well as just stamina being a factor. I mean, you might not notice it early on, especially like this far in, but as we keep continuing through these patterns, it's becoming a lot harder to maintain these jump shoot patterns. Especially with some density, and you see these jumps kind of one first jumps or maybe one half. I think it's 1/4 jumps, like continuous, which it's a little technical and it kind of makes playing this a little bit awkward as well. Not to forget like these anchors, these trills, combining them together at some points as well. I mean, you could say that this part is technically a little bit easier compared to what we just saw with like these trills. But we do get another little break here. This one's gonna be your last break though. Once you get past this break, the file gets just so much harder. I mean, you think the anchors from earlier are hard, but they get even harder. And of course, you get the add-on of those trills that we've been seeing, those right and left-handed trills. Here we go, going into this final section, we're going to see a repeat of this one-handed trill section. It's just so hard to stay consistent on this, especially for 4 minutes straight. I mean, sure, you get those breaks, but your stamina is going to be dead here. Especially because, like, there's a lot of finger control required on a pick like this one, just because of the amount of trills that are in here. But as we are starting to exit this final trill, this final one-handed trill section, we're going to get into the part that becomes just a little bit angry right here. It fluctuates between the hands, so you're still dealing with a one-handed bias, even at the very end. I mean, this part might not seem as bad as compared to like the early parts, But the fact that you have to maintain your stamina in this section, it's gonna be a lot harder just because of that stamina factor being added in. And it's gonna be so easy to mess up on this ending, especially with like this final dense build-up. But that does conclude Race 3. And moving on to Race 4, it is going to be The Night is on Fire on 1.05 times. I would say probably fairly unknown jack file. This is going to be more speed jack oriented, clocking in at 178 BPM. And this pick being a little bit tricky compared to a lot of other jack picks. It doesn't really rely on that density. Start to see these jacks coming right here. This one's being a little bit tricky, despite it being the beginning and not that dense. It's still pretty tricky to be able to hold your accuracy here. You know, we can get to this build up. We start to get into the bulk of this file. These jacks becoming very anchory, and also just being on the outer columns, making it a lot more harder. I mean, you might be okay with like inner column anchors, but these 3-note anchors on the outer columns just make for a lot more difficulty as well. And then getting into this next section, things bump up just a little bit. You see some hands in between here, but the main trickiness is just going to be being able to manage with these anchors. They start to become a little bit less apparent in here, but the fact that you have to deal with the anchors and then transition to this. And this final section, well not final section, but this middle section right here, can be a lot of just kind of movement jacks. Going left to right and right to left. It's just a lot of like different motions to go through, especially in a jack pick, because with most jack picks you might expect them to stay very consistent. But this one kind of just throws a lot of different jacks, but once you get through that, you do have this ending here, and despite it being a lot lighter, and despite there being a lot less, you still have these really tricky inner column jacks. And it makes it a lot more technical and very easy to mess up on, just because like, you literally just went through the entirety of this file, but you still have these really tricky and fast jacks as well. This pick also just being very stamina intensive, just because it's very continuous and because of how fast it is. But that does conclude your jack pick. It's a very, very fast one, and very tricky. I mean, not really focusing hard on that density aspect, but we can move on to Race 5. And this is going to be your technical pick, and it is going to be Roy. A very, very difficult tech pick. Right, it does start off very simple, but as we progress into things, you're going to see so many different patterns really improve themselves. I mean, you start to see these bursts clocking as, I believe, higher than 300 BPM. I just don't remember exactly, but a lot of these bursts are so brutal. I believe the bursts are like 110. And it smells like these tricky jacks as well. I mean, this fills basically any type of like technical aspect you can think of. If you have these really fast bursts, these really awkward motions that are very stop and go. You have these little jacks right here, which they don't seem bad, but it could be very easy to mess up on if you don't have this beat to them. This like first half mainly focusing on a lot of these kind of like dumpy, dense bursts, but then once you get into this section, we'll focus just a little bit on these mini jacks and allow just kind of transitioning between these mini jacks and these other patterns. It's not being too bad, but it really just is that aspect of holding your control on these mini jacks, especially as more of these different kind of varieties start to get introduced. All these bursts makes it very awkward, especially with these kind of strings that come up right here. And this like, second half is going to basically include everything that we've been seeing. These bursts, these mini jacks. It makes it so hard to stay consistent on, because you might be good at one aspect of the file, or you might be good at following like each part separately. But this thing, like at the end, it just combines everything and adds more gimmicks onto it as well, and it just makes staying consistent on this so hard. Especially as you get into this final section, you're gonna see these really fast trills, which kind of have a follow-up on the opposite area of the lane. And they might not seem too fast, but trying to maintain consistency on these trills are so difficult. But we do get into the ending here, where you see repetition of these patterns. Very difficult in general. This ending, even despite it having very low notes compared to everything else, it's still a bit easy to mess up on, especially with the 1/10 burst that kind of pop in every now and then. Just viewers of the patterns that we've been seeing earlier. But that will conclude our abrasive tech pick. And with that, we can go into Rise 6, our dump pick, and it is going to be One Good Reason on 1.05. I think a lot of people might be familiar with this one from Mania World Cup 2024 Grand Finals. They did use 1.1, but in Time of Mania 2, they will be using 1.05. A lot of the kind of difficulty of this kind of comes from how fast these patterns are, especially combined with like the kind of trickiness of these like streams, and as well as the density that kind of builds up as well. I mean, you could see some of these mini jacks right here, like they're not it's not a lot of notes, but it's just so tricky. It's mostly like these sections that are so easy to mess up on, like especially with a lot of these trills. It's so easy to mess up on the one-handed trills, especially because you have to constantly be playing a lot of these like racy notes. And then when it does come to these strings, you see a lot of kind of mini jack usage, creating a little bit of some trills as well. It's just so much to handle all at once, and it might not be stamina intensive compared to a lot of these other picks, but the fact that it is so awkward, especially with the fact that there's a lot of grace notes within this pick, it makes trying to add this a lot more harder, as well as just the fact that it is a dump pick. Most people don't really find these dump picks comfortable to add, just because a lot of these notes are kind of freeform. As well as just there being that technical aspect. And this 3-note changing, it doesn't seem too bad because it slows down, but trying to like adjust yourself to maintain the combo and accuracy, it just makes it so much harder. But as we do get into this final section, you're gonna see this pattern kind of just continue on and repeat. It's a lot of just these really fast streams with these mini jacks, which just makes it very easy to mess up on it. It makes it so hard to stay consistent on. And in this ending, which is going to repeat a little bit, you're going to see some density spikes every now and then. But it is very continuous. Even despite it being very continuous, maybe a little bit slower in some aspects, it's still easy to mess up on here and lose that consistency and potentially even miss. Like, especially with like some of the anchors that kind of build up on here and some of these kind of pseudo mini jacks, there's just a lot to kind of handle with a pick like this one. But with that, we can move on to our final Rise pick, or mixed pick, and it is going to be Euphoria on 1.1 times. I think this is a pick that a lot of people might be familiar with just in general, not as the tournament file, but just as a file by itself. This is an Eterna technical file. There's a lot of just really awkward patterns within this pick. But starting off, very simple patterns, just ever so slightly awkward because of those anchors that get created. And we can start off with a very simple and light jump shift action. But this is just the easiest part. We haven't even gotten to the bulk of what makes this difficult. You're going to see some of these elements kind of make their way in. They aren't too intrusive, they're fairly simple to play. And especially just because we're in grand finals, they shouldn't be a problem at all, at least compared to like earlier rounds. It's more just this jump string, hand string section with some bursts every now and then, not too common, but once we do get into this ending, this is where you're going to start to see the technicality really ramp up. You're going to see a lot of these very difficult bursts, these fast bursts, and these mini checks as well. I would say in a way this is a little bit reminiscent of our tech rice pit, rice 5, with kind of combining both those aspects of these fast bursts and these mini jacks, but making it into a gauntlet of a file. Like you have these like mini jacks which aren't like loaded with a lot of these patterns, but then you also get these like fast bursts, these faster jumps, and then you also just get times where they combine. That part also just being that left to right and movement with those mini jacks can also just be really easy to miss on and mess up on. And you start to see those patterns become a little bit more prevalent. And it's just a really awkward pattern just because you're doing back-to-back mini jacks, and especially just because it's like lane to lane. But even then, this part of the file is still like on the easier side. We haven't even gotten into like the second area where we start to see the density a little bit, but before we get there, we do have a little bit of port jack section right here, being on 1/3, I believe a 150 BPM, slightly dense, definitely a lot more denser compared to Rice 4. But the good thing is that it is slower, so it shouldn't be as bad, but it can still be very, very difficult. We're just kind of transitioning in and out of these jacks, but you slowly see them pay out. And then you do get a little bit of a break part right here. I wouldn't say a very stamina intensive file. But once you do get out of this section, the difficulty really starts to ramp up just a little bit. It might not seem like it right here just yet, but these bursts and these mini jacks start to become a lot more prevalent, and it just becomes so easy to mess up on. I mean, at least from my experience playing this file, I find myself messing up a lot more in the second half compared to like the first half, especially just because of how awkward these patterns are. And combining the awkwardness with these mini jacks, it makes for a very, very hard transition to take. As we get into this ending, you're going to see that continuous strain of these mini jacks really making themselves more prevalent, and a lot of these really fast bursts. It just makes this pick very difficult, considering that you have to stack along like the length of this pick. I mean, most of the trickiness just comes from the technicality. I mean, sure, there's a little bit of like raw skill needed in a pick like this one, but just the fact that you combine both the raw skill aspect and the technicality, it makes this a lot more harder than it might look. But as we do conclude this final section, these mini jacks finally ending. That does conclude this pick. You're just going to get very, very simple patterns right here. Nothing really else to kind of miss on or get bad judgments. It's really just making sure that you hit these elements and release them on time, which I think in a match, it isn't really going to come to that. But let us conclude our rice pool, and we can move on to Ellen's. With Ellen 1 is going to be our coordination pick. Potentially a familiar pick for some people. I believe this was featured in Philippine Nationals 2024 in Grand Finals, so a bit of a difficulty step up from last week. I mean, we did have Send in Life, which, I mean, it's kind of similar, but this one kind of takes that aspect of timing how that most people are kind of familiar with, those really fast jacks, at least with for Ellen's, and a lot of these kind of awkward releases as well. These slower sections just going to be really, really hard to stay consistent on, just because you have a lot of like transitions between these fast bursts and then these like good level speed sections. Especially something like this one, there's like so many releases all over the place, and as well as the shields that are being built up, I mean, it is a timing call. You do kind of have to expect these jacks to make their way in. And especially with these really awkward releases, it makes this just maybe not very physically biased, but it makes it very biased in terms of that like finger control aspect and being able to hold that hold string. I mean, even in a part like this one, which doesn't look as bad aside from like these bursts, it's still really hard to just keep your accuracy in check because obviously you have these jacks, these shields, and especially those longer ones. And then you also have to account for nerves, which are going to be so prevalent, especially as we are ending things off. And then more of just these jacks that I think people are all too familiar with when it comes to these like timing call-ish type stuff. And those trills in the inner columns are just going to be so easy to mess up on, just because you already have to hold the LNs on the outer columns, and having to trill on both hands while also holding LNs, it adds a lot of difficulty into a pick like this one, and it really tests your ability to hold good coordination in so many different aspects, especially like with like LN density. I mean, it's not really the main focus here, but with just how fast some of these LNs are, it tests your ability to swap between these like different types of sub skill sets. But you do get this break section, which very short, but you do get it to essentially calm your nerves down just a little bit, maybe check your opponent's score. But as we do continue into this ending here, more of these patterns, more of these shields being all over the place. And these releases just gonna be maybe a little bit hard to maintain if you aren't comfortable with this deep jump at least. Obviously you're gonna be dropping a lot of 200s within this pick just because it is a timing count. A lot of these patterns are all over the place, and being able to concentrate throughout this entire pick is just gonna be so difficult. This ending section, calming things down just a little bit, but with that ending burst, you don't want to calm down completely. But that does conclude our LN coordination pick, and we can move on to our LN density pick, which is going to be Tonshin Confluencer on 1.05 times. Another pick that isn't well too known, I would say. This one definitely strays away from your typical LN density pick though. I would say there's a little bit of a coordination aspect, even this late into the tournament. I mean, you typically don't expect that coordination aspect to be as prevalent in late game density picks, but this one still holds onto it. And it does add that layer of difficulty, as well as there just being some bursts throughout this pick, which can make it really, really easy to get a miss on. And then we are getting into the main LN density section. And hold string is going to be a little bit of an issue on this pick if you aren't comfortable with it. I mean, you see some of these longer LNs, which you're more kind of familiar with in like the earlier game LN density picks, but this one holds onto it, and it adds a layer of accuracy that is needed. Because with most LN density picks, I mean, you're able to kind of cheese them in a way if like they're fast, but this one does not allow you to do so, especially with like the bursts that are in between each LN density section, and like I said, the whole strain that's required for this one. It makes this one a little bit more technical for an LN density pick, and it makes it a little bit more physical as well. I mean, even within like these simpler LN density sections, you have those bursts, you have some releases which can be a little bit awkward. And as we do get into like the faster aspect, you do have instances where you're basically having to play 3-note density sections just because you're holding one LN at a time. And then you get this section which is a little bit lighter in terms of like the speed, but you have like that coordination aspect like I've been saying earlier. And it makes the nerves on this one just a little bit higher. It's definitely not a pick that might favor a Rice player that most LN density picks might tend to do, at least later on. This one just has so much like coordination aspect to it that it makes it really, really hard to play this if you don't have that LN skill set locked down. Continuing on with another section that's very, very familiar. These bursts coming in and out, and of course those strings, which is going to be very prevalent, but you do also have to kind of transition from like those jump trills into basically playing almost nothing to playing a lot faster bursts throughout this section. And I think these bursts are going to be primarily the reasons why most players might miss, just because they're kind of out there, and you don't really expect those type of bursts within an LN density pick. Like usually you might expect it in an LN tech pick, but in this situation they become a lot harder to control, and it really just requires like a whole new skill set to be able to master those ones. But that does conclude our LN density pick. Quite a different one compared to a lot of the previous ones, but it should be interesting to see how it goes. But coming in LN3, our technical LN, it is going to be Hazama on the cut version. I think a lot of people are familiar with this one, High Lotto Hazama. And we've seen it in Soundwave Mania LN Tournament 3, and it is also loved with the full version. But this one is going to be the cut version. I believe the same one from Soundwave Mania LN 3 Grand Finals. But definitely ramping things up a lot, especially compared to last week, I believe was Gene Disruption. It definitely is a bit of a ramp up, but these releases are going to be so awkward, especially like these 3-note LNs. I mean, it's kind of like what we saw last pick, right? At times you're having to hold one LN while still playing the density, but this time around, they're a lot longer, and a lot of these patterns are just so hard to execute just because of the shields that are involved. It adds another layer of awkwardness when you're having to play a jump and then right after there's another note. Like, it adds a little bit of that coordination aspect, but I think the primary aspect of where most people might miss is just because of these shields, where you're basically having to play a double jab, except one of those jumps are an LN. So if you let go trying to hit the other one, that's gonna cost you a lot more than it would with like usual like rice patterns like that one. But as soon as you get into this next section, you're gonna see like this kind of go together, moving back and forth, and it's gonna require a lot of just speed to play these patterns, and also just making sure that you release each section on time correctly, because on a pick like this one, you're having to do a lot of different movements, and it adds like a lot of difficulty into the mix. And especially this next session coming up right here, which is going to be slightly akin to what we've been seeing in the past, but there's just so much to handle, and especially if like you don't have a lot of coordination skill, this one's definitely going to be one of those like very, very risky picks, and definitely one of the picks that you might want to ban if one of the other elements get protected. But this ending just focusing a lot on like slight coordination, and as well as these shields that come into play very often. And that's just another layer of physicality just because of how fast you have to be to hit these shields. Or just like that, the file is ending. A lot of just these awkward releases. That will conclude the third rice pick. And moving on to our final pick, it is going to be over the full range shift on 1.05 time. This is going to be a bit of a more wild card LN. This one featuring a lot of just jumps in general, but the patterns in this one are also just so awkward. This is, I would say, probably one of the most fun LN picks I've seen. Not even just in this tournament, but outside of the tournament. There's just a lot of creativity in this, and there's a lot of expression shown within this file as well. There isn't really a section that you can really pull a break, just because there's a lot happening at once. And especially within a section like this one, where it might look fairly slow, but the fact that you have these rice bursts and the fact that there's just so much going on, it makes this a lot harder. And especially trying to hold good accuracy on this is just going to be so much harder, because you have all these awkward releases mixed in with the already precedented releases. And as well as just transitioning between these LNs and like the rice bursts that happen in between. It's really easy to miss on this one, and especially the length, given that it's very long. and you just kind of continue that. I mean, you start to see a little bit of mixture within the patterning. You start to see some of the elements just grow a little bit longer. But it's just so technical just to act, and especially like the fact that there's rice bursts mixed in, and they're very fast. Like, you might even miss on the rice bursts instead of some of the elements just because of how fast they are and how awkward they are. But even then, like, trying to hold the coordination for these elements are so difficult. You get this slightly break section, but like I said earlier, you have these like rice bursts that go on, so it makes it not really a break part, just very technical, especially with how fast they ramp up at times. But it is a little bit of a break from that hold stream that most people might be akin to, with like these element picks. As we slowly start to get back into accepting, the rice bursts are going to become just a little bit less prevalent, and you're going to see the element ramp up just a little bit more. And here we go. As we get into this final chorus, the element kind of starts to become a lot more tricky. You start to see a lot more shields within this area. They become a lot more dumpy, a lot more tricky to act. It's just a really, really strong consistency test, and this file, as hard as it may be, it is generally one of the most fun files ever, just in general. There's so much happening all at once, but it is so easy just to follow it all. And just the aspect of this being so technical and just really fast as well. Not that fast, but it can be stamina draining if you aren't prepared for it. And as we get into this final stretch, the stamina aspect is definitely going to become a big factor here. Kind of start to smooth out just a little bit, but the fact that you've been playing almost 4 minutes already and you still have to continue on with this final section makes it just a little bit harder, even despite it maybe just being slightly easier. The rice burst starts to become more intact, testing your ability to control those nerves. So this is just a huge nerve test. And the fact that you have all these awkward releases alongside it, it makes this pick just full of everything. There isn't really any way to describe this pick besides just having everything. But that does conclude Element 4. Move on to the hybrids. Start off with our first hybrid, our more streamy one, and it's going to be Ultimate Force and Edit. This was also featured in Philippine Nationals finals, so you see that difficulty really starts to be brought up here. It's beginning being fairly calm, but you start to see these staggered releases, which you don't really expect maybe in a pick like this one, which is usually it's a bit more simpler, but you have these really awkward patterns, especially for like a straight hybrid, and it really incorporates that hybrid aspect where neither side, neither rice player, neither element player are completely safe. You just have to be able to play these hybrids. You just have to be really well-rounded in general. And especially just because of how kind of stop and go this could be at times. Not fully stop and go, but there's that aspect of it still in here. You get this kind of pseudo break section, there isn't as much going on. It can still be easy to drop on this in here though, just given like some of these bursts, as well as like these elements like starting to intrude their way into here, adding a sense of technicality that we've already been seeing as well, especially just because of how some of these releases can be very, very awkward. Slowly to leave this break section, and you start to see those bursts kind of come back that we saw earlier, with that kind of motion of making sure that your coordination is intact. movement that's been going on just a little bit here until we get back into it. More of this judo stop and go section. It's going to be very bursty just in general. It really just tests your ability to focus on very fast patterns and almost nothing for like a split second and then right back to that part. These 3-note island sections, which can be very hard to coordinate. As final burst right here, slowing down just a little bit, but that will conclude your first hybrid. And moving on to hybrid 2, it is going to be Q, another Philippines personal release, your work Jack hybrid. This one being a little bit technical as well. You're gonna see these patterns right here, which might not seem too bad just because of the speed, but they start to speed up just a little bit. These are very, very simple, and it's gonna give you a lot of room to build up that accuracy. And this is where you start to see the difficulty increase just a little bit. And you start to see it slowly and just ever increasing. And these jacks start to become a little bit longer. And this is where you start to really see those type of hybrid jacks that I think most people are all too familiar with. That shieldy aspect, and some of these jacks even almost mimicking a kind of timing held type of pattern. Like with some of these 3-note jacks, I mean, a pick like this one can feel kind of similar to a timing hell, but just in the form of a hybrid. And I think that just adds a lot of just difficulty all around. I mean, neither of these first two hybrids being like very simple that you might expect, because I mean, it's a streamy hybrid or it's a jacky hybrid. You expect them to typically just be a bit on the simpler side. Maybe the jack one being just a little bit difficult. And you start to see these trills make their way in slowly, but going back into the patterns that we've been seeing with a lot of these awkward mini jacks kind of coming in. As we get to this ending, this thing's getting so much more difficult. A lot of these patterns just loading up in density just to simplify. And this final section is just gonna be very brutal as well. Like, these jacks are so awkward, especially when you have to hold one in the inner column and tap the outer column. Those ones just require another sense of coordination. Like that, it's this ending which builds up completely and ends just right there. And with that, let's move on to hybrid 3, which is going to be Overdead by Imperial. I think another slightly familiar file. It is going to be on base right now. This one's Fleet Monster. And we start off very technical already. You start to see these really awkward patterns. You're going to see a little bit of that kind of stopping the motion intact here. But also as well as just these really, really awkward releases. The bulk of what makes this so hard is because of how bursty it is and how awkward some of these patterns are, such as this one. We've commented before on how hard it is to have to hold 2 LNs on 2 separate hands, and the other columns have to play those trills. It's so hard, and there's such a really large coordination aspect that is needed. I mean, all these hybrids, they don't favor Rice or Ellen players. It favors being well-rounded. And that's what things are just going to be going down to. I mean, especially with just this being grand finals, I mean, the more well-rounded players are going to be able to take it. And these like 3-note patterns are so difficult, because 3-note column sections are typically difficult. But when you add another sense of technicality to them and you make it fast, it is so easy to choke on them. You have to be able to play them perfectly if you want to be able to get a point on something like this one. You see these shows slow down just a little bit as we do get into this mini break section. But just like all Ellens and hybrids, the break section is usually never a break. You have these really awkward patterns that you still have to go through, and especially with how tight some of these releases are. get into this dump section, which is going to slowly transform into a bit of a more jacking section as we start to see right here. And as we get into this ending section, things are going to ramp up just a little bit. It might not look too dense, but the fact that you're having to hold some of these elements, which is being sandwiched by these jacks, it makes it so hard. It's just another test of that coordination aspect that's really needed. And as we do get into this little burst here, and just very fast patterns in general, which is going to be so easy to miss on, because you have to go back from playing those jacks into these really awkward patterns. So that's through hybrid 3. And we can move on to the SV. And SV1 is going to be movement. It is going to contain reverse SV gimmicks. I believe maybe the first time we see them in Soundwave Mania 2. And you can see that if you miss on those reverse sections, it's going to be very brutal to reading this. And not to mention that this is the reading pick, so it is going to be a little bit more forgiving. Just get these slow jumps with these stutters, but then you get into this section right here, so we contain a little bit of memory. But the memory sections are telegraphed, and again, you're going to see one right here. And then finally getting into the main section where the slow jam starts to become more apparent. Not going to be too memory focused, but you're definitely going to need to get the muscle memory to play something like this. I mean, if the memory section that we saw earlier wasn't already enough proof that you can't sight read something like this, then hopefully this part is, just because of how slow it gets and how hard it gets to read. I mean, there's a very, very slight sense of memory needed, but it's more so just muscle memory and being able to perform those patterns over and over again. But it does switch over to this slow jam stuttering section. Section looking deceptively easy, just because the notes do a little pause before going in. That is something to be aware of, but it is fairly okay to go back. But that part shouldn't be a problem. Then going back into this kind of memory section right here. And back into this build up right here that we've seen before. And just a little pause before we get back into what we've been seeing. And this part is going to be a little bit harder because it does mess with your muscle memory just a little bit. You see the patterns, they don't have that 3 repetition that we've been seeing before. I believe there's like only one time it appears, like right there, I believe. But it's just going to make playing it so much harder. But once you get past all of that, you do move on back into this slow jam stutter section. A very, very simple part, especially as the patterning does simplify as well. There really isn't too much to mess up on here. More so just being able to transition from the more complex patterning to this section. But that does conclude our first SV. And moving on to our memory pick, it is going to be Buzzbox 76. This pick definitely being pretty difficult to learn, but I do think in its usage, it is a fairly fun one as well. This one's gonna definitely rely on you just knowing how this works. I mean, a lot of these sections can almost be seen as reading, like especially a section like this one. But once we do get into the main section, you're gonna see a lot of that kind of memory aspect start to form, even in the build-up, such as like that part as well. And then this part, it might seem very simple, but you're gonna have to be double tapping these elements just because there are notes. It is the spirit of weekend gimmick in this jump shot as well. And in this part right here, which it doesn't come across as very difficult, and it isn't, but you will see that the section does get a little bit trickier right here. Start to see them change between the lanes, And you're just gonna have to know that it happens, and you're just gonna have to know when it happens as well. It doesn't happen for that long, but it's still fairly difficult to just perfect as well. Then this next section up here, mostly being a little bit of a reading section, nothing too complicated. I do believe this photo will have a little bit of a repeat aspect to it. This part, just have to remember it exists. This section being more kind of leaning in the reading side, nothing too heavy to memorize. I mean, obviously you do have to know the kind of fluctuations in the scroll, which can be just a different challenge on its own, just because, I mean, you just have to know when to be fast and when to kind of slow down. But this next section, definitely going to rely on that memory section. You're going to get these mini jump trills, and then you're going to get either one note or two notes in the inner columns. And just knowing when it switches between both of them makes it a little bit harder, and especially transitioning into them. Like with those elements, it's just so hard to transition in and out of those. So that concludes our reading, our memory SV. With that, we can move on to the tiebreaker. I will let that one play.